Okay, I'm here with my good friend Nijay Gupta, a man who is regarded as the Tom Haverford of biblical studies. Me, on the other hand, I'm obviously the Jason Bourne of biblical studies. Well, Jason Bourne / Conan O'Brien / Hugh Jackman / Leon Morris.
Yeah. I'll give you some Simon Pegg. I'll give you a little Simon Pegg.
Yeah, well, I've been told I'm more like the Austin Powers of biblical studies.
There you go.
Which is sadder because it's probably truer than me being Jason Bourne. Although that said, no one's ever seen me in the same room with Jason Bourne. I just want to.
That's true. That's true.
That is true. That is.
And you have military training, so.
Exactly. That's why I keep saying people don't think, so what did you do before your biblical school? I was a paratrooper.
Right.
No, seriously, what did you do?
Really?
No, I was a paratrooper and military intelligence operator.
And you have the pictures to prove it.
Yeah, exactly. But speaking of the military, Paul was being detained under a kind of military guard in some location when he was writing Paul's letter to the Philippians. Now, some people say that is in Rome. But I've taken a slightly different view on this. So what's your thought? I know you're a little bit more ambivalent on this or less committed. What's your initial thoughts on what are the options, Nijay? What are the options?
Yeah, well, I you know this way better than I do, but historically it's been Rome. That's been kind of a favored view from very early on in Christian history. I suppose I've tended to default to that just because there's some attestation early on for that, not first century, obviously, but there's a leaning towards that. We know Paul was imprisoned in Rome, and that's a place where you can get in big trouble. But actually, in our commentary, we talk about Ephesus as a possible location. And there's some other ones as well. Caesarea, is that one of the main options as well?
Yep.
I kind of left it to you, Mike. I'm not great with chronology or location in terms of putting this thing in. So I'm gonna just kick it back to you and say, you were kind of one of the first things you said about this commentary is you feel pretty strongly about an Ephesian imprisonment. What are some of the reasons? Because that's rubbed people the wrong way.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I wouldn't say it's like self-evident. I understand the reference to Rome in certainly as a traditional reading and the way people take it. But there's several things for me that support the reference to Rome. For a start, all the trips that the people are making between, say, Philippi and Paul's location make a lot more sense. It's a lot easier if Paul is in Ephesus, because it's then one trip,
right.
one trip across the Aegean, or maybe around the Via Egnatia if they really had to. But I think there's a lot if you plot all the trips about people like Paul and Timothy and Epaphroditus and all these sorts of people's coming out. They found out Paul was in prison, and then they sent this person with this money, and Paul thanked them. It's better than that they're just going across the Aegean rather than the Aegean and the Adriatic. Okay. The other thing is, I think when Paul writes in Philippians 3, he gets a lot of polemics, throws a lot of shade on Jewish Christian proselytizers who think Gentiles need Jesus and Moses. Mm-hmm. And I get the feeling that something like Galatians and the incident at Antioch are still fairly fresh in his mind. And the other thing is, I think some of the traditional arguments for the Roman provenance don't work when they, like the reference to the Praetorian Guard.
I was going to mention that one.
Yeah, that the Praetorian doesn't, I don't think Paul was imprisoned in the barracks in Rome that was reserved for basically enemies of the state, like senators accused of treason were put in the Praetorian, not some kind of religious fanatic from the East. Okay.
So what could it mean, Mike, if they refer to that in an Ephesian context?
Well, I think it simply refers to an imperial residence. It could simply be the governor's area because, there's reference to the Praetorian in the Gospels, like, Jesus is led into the Praetorian, which just means like the governor's or the ruler's headquarters. So it can be very, very bland, but it can also be used to describe like an imperial administrative center where they organize anything from taxes to anything to do with the emperor's affairs in that city. And there's been a number of articles that have come out recently that have been arguing that exact point. I know Eugene Boring put out one article. There was another one, I can't remember the guy's name, but I thought that was very persuasive. And also the reference to Caesar's household. Again, I don't think the Roman emperor, whether it's Claudius or Nero if it's in the 60s, kind of had Paul in his own little personal house with his own personal staff.
Right.
Caesar's household was the name for the imperial bureaucracy.
Right.
The family.
It's almost a misnomer to call it household because it makes us think of like, your dog, your cat, your 2 kids, or 3 kids.
Exactly.
It's more estate or something like that.
Yeah. So the Caesar's household, or the family of Caesar, was a name for all the slaves and freedmen who worked in the imperial bureaucracy, the people who, managed everything from the taxes to the promulgation of laws, and making sure the emperor's affairs were being looked after in each particular area. And we know in places like Ephesus, there were, like, I think, during Paul's time, 2 procurators, 2 persons who were there, in addition to the governor of the province, and the procurators were there, usually freedmen of the equestrian order, or not always freedmen, but at least equestrians, there to look after the emperor's affairs.
Right.
Yeah. So
I think that wasn't there. I think it was a dissertation that was arguing this. Is it Flexenhammer or something? And he also kind of said that mention of the Caesar's household could refer to slaves that were kind of traveling back and forth and may have known slaves of Christian communities, and they come into contact. So I think what I like about your kind of rethinking of this is we need to examine some of these kind of cherished traditions and really look at what the real evidence is rather than kind of assumptions.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. But that's enough of I guess me. I guess when you think of Philippians, NJ, everyone thinks of one particular key text, which has to be the Christ hymn. Now, the way I explain the Christ hymn, I say, like, if you've ever seen the musical Evita, I don't know whether you have. You probably haven't.
I haven't.
If you've ever seen the musical Evita, what everyone is waiting for is the first song in the second act, which is "Don't Cry for Me, Argentina."
Right.
That's what you're waiting for. Okay, it's a great show, but that is the song you're waiting for. In Philippians, the piece that we're all waiting for is what is called the Christ hymn of Philippians 2, 5-11. First question to you on that, NJ, is it really a hymn?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time on this, and I'm really interested in this kind of subject because there was a kind of era of scholarship that was obsessed with pre-Pauline Christianity, that kind of tunnel period between the resurrection of Jesus and the kind of advent of Paul's ministry. And you have this kind of unknown years, primitive Christianity, some people call it. And there's and people kind of want to scratch at that and get down to it like it's some kind of subdermal layer. And so we have all these, hunts for, hymns and things. So I think at best we can be agnostic. We can say maybe someone else wrote it, maybe they didn't. We have to say there's nothing un-Pauline about it. So I hate these conspiracy theories that some primitive hymn existed and Paul had to change it for this. It's just a speculative theory. Now, could Paul come up with a really poetic, beautiful thing on the spot? I think he could. I think Randy Richards done a good job of saying letters weren't something Paul wrote in one day and just dashed off. I think Richards said that like a letter like Romans may have taken him months, may have cost him up to $2,000 in modern currency in terms of the production level of something like that. So for Philippians, I think Paul could have done it. I think he's well capable of nice turns of phrases and things. So I guess I will say there's nothing that would strike me as not Pauline about it. And for Paul to come up with it, maybe with some friends, maybe he has some friends there that, they're coming up with something. I actually like to refer to it as an ode because I agree with scholarship that says it's encomiastic, which is a fancy word of saying it is a tribute to somebody. And it has all the marks of a tribute. It's hard. What is a hymn? How do you define a hymn? Does it have to have so many stanzas? Does it have to be in a book with songs? I think that language got popular. Carmen Christie but I think now we're in a place where we're kind of shrugging and saying, what's the point of labeling it a hymn? I don't know. I would say it's definitely poetic. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think, it points to primitive Christianity?
I mean, there are some indications about whether the language is pre-Pauline or not. It's hard to say. I don't know, because it assumes we've got a wide sort of set against which you can compare all language and say this is
Right.
Paul, this is not Paul. You never know for certain. It may be the case that Paul has partly inherited something and then reworked it, but again, we just don't know. It's possibly pre-Pauline, but we don't know. We know in the current form it definitely does belong to Paul.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's like a Gnostic hymn that has been adapted by Paul. I find that fairly unbelievable for several reasons. Yeah, on the genre, yeah, I mean, people have sung this, but I don't think it was a tender. I mean, one of the guys who goes to my church is Ben Edsel, and he wrote an article
Oh,
with
yeah.
Jennifer Strawbridge, basically saying this is so not a hymn.
Yeah.
Eventually along those lines. But I guess but the bigger question is about what's the purpose of it, and one of the debates is this hymn or poem or what you call it, a economiastic ode? Let's call it the ode, the Christ ode. Is this charismatic? Is it a proclamation, or is it merely offering an ethical paradigm?
I used to be almost completely within the ethical paradigm camp, and as I've reread Ernst Käsemann and some other folks, I kind of want to say both and. You can't help but honor Christ. That's what an encomiastic text does. You can't just say they're only a model. I mean, he does things that are really unique. He's super exalted, Hooper Upsao. He's super exalted and given the name above every name. You can't give that away to other people. I can't have that. So I think if it is imitation, an imitational ode, which I think it is, I think we have to allow there to be some clear praising of Christ as unique in there. And I think Michael Gorman has done some of this in his work on that. But I think, to me, it's a both and I've been just reading Helen Bond's recent book on Marcus' biography, Marcus Bias. And she talks about, is a biography about the person or is it about how we should live? In a sense, it's both. As Bias were often encomiastic, right? They were trying to praise somebody in a unique way while at the same time saying, be like that person. And so I kind of want to have my cake and eat it too in this situation.
I'm all about the cake. I'm all about the cake. Okay, final element of the Christ ode.
Yes.
What's it doing with Christology? Because I mean, there's some debate on this. Does it teach a pre-existent figure of Jesus, or is Jesus like a new Adam? Is he just like wisdom? Is Jesus exalted to the divine identity, or does he remain a kind of subordinate intermediary figure? I mean, there's a whole bunch of debates on the Christ hymn.
Yeah, so we have to talk about what the hymn does and doesn't do in terms of what we can get out of it, and it doesn't give us all these details about, was it Augustine that said, when someone asked him what was God doing before he created the world, and he said he was creating a special place in hell for people to ask that question. I think that's the kind of thing that we get ourselves into when we try to ask these questions that don't fit into that space. But I will say, let's just focus on form of God. There's been a long history of translating that nature, and I think that's 100% wrong. I don't know where you stand, but Marcus Bachmiel, Stephen Fowl, a bunch of other people, Susan Eastman, have very, very definitively, in my view, Hellerman argued that it's not about internal nature, it's about form. But form doesn't mean like putting on a shirt, like to cover yourself. Form means essentially glory. And this makes sense. Hellerman's done a good job of painting this within honor and shame context. So in the form of God, meaning, just like God, in the heavenly realm, it doesn't answer the question whether there's an intermediary figure, but all along in Philippians, it's very clear that, this Binitarian, Larry Hurtado, this unique role for Jesus. But I would say I like to talk about Philippians 2 as almost a cosmic parable. Now, that doesn't mean it's not true. It just means the language he's using is very cosmic. So he's in this gloried state, like on Mount Olympus or whatever, and then he's brought to the lowest state. Mike, it says he came in the form of a slave. He actually didn't. He came in the form of a relatively unwealthy person, not a slave. So already we're getting into imaginative language. It's trying to show this great uh, spatial dynamic of lowering himself in the very highest place. In order to do that, he has to be in a very high place. He has to be in the divine realm and then come down. And then to be super exalted, goes back up there. So it doesn't really answer the question, all the questions we want, but it definitely points to a very high Christology.
Yeah, I think it does, and there is the kind of like you said, the V shape from from heavenly divine state. Now, whether that's honorific, ontological, or just the outward display of divinity,
Right.
Human form, slavery, death on a cross, and then super exalted, to use the language. But it is interesting the way Paul, or the original author, deploys the language of Isaiah 45.
Yeah, at the end, for sure.
Jesus, and that's often what's called one of the many Yahweh texts, with language used to describe Yahweh, particularly from Deuteronomy 6 or Isaiah,
Sure.
then applied to Jesus. That has been one of the very interesting things that people have pointed out.
Yeah, I think that's crystal clear. Richard Bauckham, David Capes have pointed this out. I don't think you can get adoptionism out of this text. It's one of the few times I disagree with my mentor Jimmy Dunn about some of his interpretations of Christology. But let's change gears. Let's talk about chapter 1, because you did a lot more of the work on chapter 1 than I did in our commentary. And there's some really interesting things in chapter 1. So one of the big questions that scholars ask, I don't think church people ask this question, but scholars ask it: was Paul contemplating suicide? He has this, on the one hand, death would be great. I can go to heaven, I can play harps and watch Netflix all day. On the other hand, oh well, I should stay in ministry. And some scholars say, oh, he was considering suicide. They look at Socrates, they look at some other folks. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I see the parallels that people draw between, Socrates, approaching, looking for a noble death type of a thing, and maybe hypothetically, but there's nothing that really convinces me that that's what Paul is on about, that he's preparing to end his own life before someone else does it for him. I don't see in that. And, with the joy that you get through the letter as well, Paul does not strike me as someone on the cusp of ending his own life. And I do wonder if this is one of the things where people are a little bit guilty of trying to overly psychologize the letter and treating this as, pathway to Paul's, psyche and internal struggle and a kind of agony. Almost it comes to a Shakespearean, to be or not to be, that is the question. 'Tis a nobler in the mind to bear the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. I don't think that's where Paul's mind is at when he's writing it, although I appreciate some of the parallels people drawn, but interesting, well argued, but I'm not convinced.
Right. Yeah, many years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I wrote an article on that called Paul and the Honorable Wish for Death. There's actually a Jewish pattern where you have these Jews, Israelites and Jews, who are in pitiable situations, and they just say, God, just strike me dead. I'm miserable. So you think of Moses does this, Elijah does this, and you have other examples. You have this in Tobit as well. And so I paint that as part of that, where rhetorically he's saying, it looks like I'm in a really pitiable situation, but actually God's working in this. So I think there's other ways around that kind of issue. Let me pivot from there to an even more controversial issue in Philippians: the question of enemies and opponents. And I even think in the commentary, you and I disagree a little bit on this. So I held my tongue a little bit because I felt like you had a little bit stronger passion and argumentation on this. But maybe now is the time to get into fisticuffs over this. But there's views that range from there are present and dangerous and capricious opponents right there, boots on the ground in Philippi. And then you have like Morna Hooker, right, who says phantom opponents. There's no opponents. It's a figment of your imagination. Paul talks about various groups of people. Beware. Where do you stand on this, and what's some of the evidence?
Well, I think there's different groups. So I think some of his warnings are about what I would call local pagan critics who are persecuting people in Philippi. So the local church there
Mhm.
is mistreating, ostracizing, imprisoning, the local Philippian assembly. But I do think in chapter 3, Paul is worried that some of the Jewish Christian agitators that he's experienced in Antioch and Galatia may follow him around to Philippi and start messing with some of his converts there, or the Gentile assemblies. And we get some of Paul's most, invective polemics, particularly in chapter 3. Watch out for those dogs, those mutilators of the flesh.
Right.
I mean, this is talking some serious smack.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think there may be different groups he's talking about that. It gets more controversial when he talks about others, whose God is their stomach.
Right.
I mean, for me, that language I think is more general and more stereotypical. People who are belly worshippers, or
Right. Right.
just either uh, not necessarily licentious or indulgent, but this is just the way you talk about people you don't like. So
What does he mean by enemies of the cross of Christ? I just preached on this the other day, and it's really enigmatic language. It's some of the most forceful language that you find in any of Paul's letters. Why does he say enemies of the cross of Christ?
Well, I mean, there could be, if they're pagan opponents, they just don't like the idea of Jews worshiping or a Jewish faction worshiping a Christ or a messianic savior in ways that cause riots and that thing. So they're against the whole message of the cross being proclaimed. If it's referring to Jews, it's those who don't like the idea of a crucified Messiah, because that's just like fried ice. It doesn't
Right.
make any sense, particularly if this crucified Messiah is being identified with Israel's God in some way and being venerated and worshipped, and it's causing internal divisions within synagogue communities in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it depends on where you fall on who you think he's talking about in any given section.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I find it interesting. I've for a long time, and I see what you're saying, but I've tend to lean in favor of the view that he's more rhetorically pointing to kind of light and darkness examples. On the positive side, you have Timothy, Epaphroditus, you have Christ, you have Paul, and then on the shadow side, you have all these figures. But some of them are so specific that they do, and Paul is being himself harassed, as he says in chapter 1. You could be right that there are these people that seem to follow him around. The book of Acts kind of says that there are people that kind of follow Paul around and pester him from place to place.
It's the anti-groupies.
Yeah, that's right.
Or we call them stalkers these days, or
Yeah.
trolls, the ancient trolls. That's what they'd be. The
Although
ancient
although trolls can be cute little dolls with interesting hair. So
not since about the 1990s, I think, NJ.
you don't watch the movies?
Oh yeah, the troll. Yeah, there was Trolleys, was it? Oh, that's so trolly. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've got young children, so it's been a long time since I've seen a movie that wasn't made by Pixar.
There you go.
Yeah, so I'm kind of in that camp too. Yeah, well, I think Philippians 3 is specific. He's talking about these Jewish Christian proselytizers, trolls who follow him around. But in some of the other places in the letter, I'd be prepared to accept that this might be a bit more general, particularly, whose God is their stomach, that type of a thing. I think that could be general. Although in chapter 1, I think it might be the local pagan critics. Context decides on that. But yeah.
Yeah, their God is their stomach. I think there's a parallel in Romans which shows that he can use this in more than one place as kind of real dangers.
And the other funny thing is, someone pointed out that the word for stomach, what is in Greek, koilia or something, can also refer to one's genitals.
Yeah, so was that Carl Sandness? Was he one of those people?
Yeah, it was him, but there was
belly and body.
Yeah, there was another guy who, in an Expository Times article, wrote an article on it. Yeah. And so you could be like these, calling them penis worshippers. I mean, all they care about is cutting off the ends of penises. They're just all about the circuit. They're all about the penis. Paul could be saying that his Jewish opponents are the because of their focus on circumcision, are the equivalent of a phallic cult.
Yeah. Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
I mean, and there's a few interesting passages in the Septuagint where kolia is used to describe the genitals.
Sure.
So I mean that would be some ultimate kind of turnaround smack talk. Ah, yeah, watch out for those penis worshippers.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We did not go in that direction necessarily with the
Yeah, I
commentary,
think
but
that may have been. I think I gave that a footnote.
suggestion. Right.
Yeah, I don't think I made that our main translation. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
there we are.
Yeah. So somewhat similarly, in First Thessalonians, I think phi opts for skuos, vessel, as a phallic image. I think he leans in that direction. So it'll be another. It's a different word, but it's another point in that favor of that. Well, transitioning from that, I don't know how you transition from that, but in chapter 3, something I've always been intrigued with, Mike, is politeuma, which is in chapter 3, verses 20 and 21. Paul says, all this bad stuff is going on, but he says our citizenship or commonwealth is in heaven. And I remember N.T. Wright saying, this was long in the 90s. I think he said, it's not talking about citizenship. It's talking about a place, a commonwealth. And I've seen mixed views on that. And I'm not quite sure that's right. What's your take on that? Because citizenship is one thing. And then colony, he translated as colony.
Yeah.
And colony is a whole different thing. And Hellerman disagrees. Hellerman thinks there's no evidence for that. But Wright said that over and over and over again. Yeah,
I mean, I certainly lean towards the colony view because it makes sense because Philippi was a Roman colony, so there was the sense in which the city of Philippi was prided or is premised on the whole of having like a Roman constitution, and it was a bit of Rome away from Rome. And it was meant to be an outpost of Rome to represent Rome's culture and values, and on a very sort of important part of of northern Greece where it was a very important route. So it's good to have good friends in places like that. So I do think contextually that the colony imagery would resonate. Now, whether it's really can bear the weight of the word politeuma. And how that word is used in the lexical sense or in whatever discourses it appears, that's probably a separate debate. But I mean, what do you think? What do you think, Nijay? What's your gut feeling?
So I was hoping you'd ask. No, I'm just kidding. But I feel like it's best to split the difference. So it's not individual identity, definitely, because he could have said that in other ways. Neither is it a place, but I think it's more of a socio-political identity. So our corporate political identity comes from a different place because he uses that word savior, soter, which is would have really sent off real clear signals combined with politeuma that this is some kind of political rescuer. And I think it's a reminder of their identity. So the example I like to give when I teach on this is like, I don't know if you like soccer or, rugby or what, but, if you've traveled to a sports game to a different city and you wear your jersey, right? And in that foreign place, you're representing your social community. And in many ways, your political community, because you're identifying with a city like Portland or Melbourne or whatever. And I think of it like that. Here, these Christians are in a kind of resident alien status, and yet they wear this shirt of Christian to associate with other Christians that come from a different place. And that doesn't mean we long to go to heaven to get away from the earth, but it does mean we need to behave. So like instead of creating a riot because your team didn't win the game, you have to remember where you're from. You have to remember what your home is like, so to speak. And so I think of it more as kind of socio-political cooperative identity rather than something like a place.
Well, that's interesting. I think that rings true because Paul wants the Philippians to live a life worthy of their citizenship, of their Savior. I mean, it's the language Paul uses it several times. Mm-hmm. So trying to live out Christian values in a sort of, Roman, Greek, pagan context, which is a good segue to the next question. Does Paul in any way replicate Roman values? Because there are some parts of Philippians, particularly chapter 4, where Paul sounds a bit like a Stoic philosopher. whether I have much or I have little, I've learned to be
Right.
content whatever I have. Is this Paul doing his own little Seneca impersonation? Is
Right.
Paul
Right.
is Paul a Stoic?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I just got done reading. I don't know if you've read Luke Timothy Johnson's new book, Constructing Paul. He actually has a really good chapter on this, and he says that you know, Pauline scholars tend to overinterpret the evidence, and they really go searching for these kinds of things. And if you go search for them, then you're going to find them. And we have a tendency to just love those parallels. I would say that, and Johnson says the parallels are just too broad to create meaningful connection there. So I agree with people like N.T. Wright, Oda Vishmeyer, who say you can't really prove that he is really depending on those things. If he is grabbing them, he's grabbing them out of the popular air, just like we might quote movies. And we're not endorsing all the movies that we quote, but this is just something that just is well known enough. You can kind of pull these out of the air and use them as examples. I think, is Paul being sensitive to a Roman Philippi audience? Actually, a number of scholars say, don't assume the readers are Roman citizens just because they're in a Roman colony. Probably almost none of them were. I think Peter Oak says that, Hellerman says that. And it's a good reminder that you see a lot of what I call folk exegesis, where you see people just throw out these things. Oh, it's a Roman colony, therefore everybody was Roman, everybody was a veteran. Almost none of them probably were. So I think the connections there, I think they're very broad. They're kind of culturally broad. So Mike, you're Australian, you come to the US, you're going to throw out some American illustrations like who's had French fries? This is what Americans eat. That, but you're not trying to go really deep into American culture. And I think Paul is doing a lot of that. So I do think, and I'm praising, I'm singing the praises here of Hellerman. I do think Hellerman is right that the Roman Philippians, the residents there, were honor obsessed. He's gone a long way to prove that. So I think he is pulling pieces out that are going to address that. But I think he's overturning that. I don't think he's patting them on back. I don't think he's stroking their egos. I think he's trying to subvert that, as he does with the cursus pudorum, this inversion of honor that Christ goes through for the sake of his obedience to God. So I think there are little signals that he's using, language that they will resonate with and understand, like our citizenship is heaven, live as citizens, and so forth. You were talking about chapter 4, where he uses these words about virtue and things. I think he is signaling. I don't think he's signaling in a way that'll make Romans happy. Would you say that's your assessment?
Yeah, I think, he can echo some similar language at
Mhm.
times, but I think his center of gravity is ethics. It's got there's a different sun in his universe.
Yeah.
And Kevin Rowe's book, One True Life, he's pointed out that Paul's ethics and Stoicism, if anything, they're two somewhat parallel competing worldviews.
The rivals.
I don't think Paul is kind of leeching off a little bit of Stoicism here and there to make him sound popular or current or contemporary or anything. I mean, there is definitely overlaps on the honor and shame side. I think Paul is plugging into there, but he does that everywhere. He does that in Corinthians especially, and in his other letters. But I don't see Paul as a Stoic per se. He's just capable of riffing a few things. It's like I've got a standard bunch of jokes I always do when I go to America, usually related to Chick-fil-A and why wasn't Bill Clinton removed from office. Jokes about that, which work depending on the context.
Right.
Yeah,
you have to know your people.
Yeah, well, if I'm in Boston, I make jokes about kind of Texas and Alabama, and if I'm in Alabama and Texas, I make jokes about people who live in Boston.
That's right.
And that type of a thing.
I would say I did some research on this for a different project on Paul and Stoicism, like for example Paul and Seneca, and they agree on really broad things like life is a battle, right? And they agree on just kind of general elements of persevering and suffering. But then when you get down into the nitty gritty, there would be so much that Seneca would find really foul about the way Paul thinks about life. But one quote out of Seneca could be put right into Paul's letters. It's disaster is virtue's opportunity. And I think Paul thought very much the same way, but we have to remember many ancient people thought this way, in terms of kind of think about the British, just, grin and bear it, just hunker down. I mean, this idea that life should be easy, people in the ancient world just didn't have easy lives, so they never assumed that.
Yeah, famous Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, he's famous for his quote, "Life wasn't meant to be easy."
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's
That's what I tell my kids. That's great.
life wasn't meant to be easy. Why do you think God made me your dad? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fair enough. Probably one final topic we might want to touch on is the famous Pistis Christou debate.
Yes.
Chapter 3. Do you want to outline the problem for us, Nijay?
Oh boy, yeah. So this is quite a topic that's received a lot of essays. You've edited a book on it, Mike,
and I'm still none the wiser. I mean,
and you have some interesting views, because you don't just take one side on this. I think you don't drill down on one side only. But the basic is, you have this Greek phrase pistis Christou. One view is it means human faith in Jesus Christ. The other view is it's referring to Christ's faithfulness to God. That's the most common understanding of the subjective genitive view. And there's a clear dividing line between scholars. You have like a John Barclay, a Barry Matlock on one side, and then you have like a Doug Campbell, N.T. Wright, and all these folks on the other side. And they're very serious about this, and there's been dozens and dozens of articles. I just wrote a chapter for the Oxford Handbook of Pauline Studies on Pistis Christou.
Oh, wow.
And so I just read everything about 3 months ago, which go back many decades. And there's just so much, and it keeps piling up. I have never been enchanted with a subjective genitive. I just feel like there's no clear tent poles there. If Paul wanted to say that, he would have said it in clear ways. You seem to be sympathetic to it in places. Tell me why.
Yeah, well, most of the time, I would go for faith in Christ.
Right.
Because I think that makes sense of the context. And the fact is, when Paul says, faith, pistis or pistuo, dia ek, or, dia ek pistis, it usually means faith is the instrument for connection or orientation towards Jesus. So most of the time, I'll pretty much defer to what's called the objective genitive view, faith in Christ. Philippians 3, I think, is the most ambiguous and the most complex passage, because I think there is far more material to work with on either side. Now, on the one hand, you could argue that in this context, Paul does explicitly refer to believing in Christ, knowledge of Christ, and all these things, where Christ is the object of knowledge, the object of believing. Paul also does make a contrast between, do you get righteousness by the observance of Torah, or do you get the righteousness by way of believing in Christ? I think that sort of contrast is very clear. I don't think it's redundant to say that, as some allege, that Paul talks about believing and pistis kind of compacted together, that one has to mean faith, one has to mean faithfulness. I don't think that works. And generally when Paul employs the language of dia and ek, he's talking about faith as the human instrument of being connected to Christ by faith. But there are some threads here that are worth considering. On the one hand, Paul has mentioned Jesus' obedience in the preceding chapter. In chapter 2, verses 8, where Christ is the one who exercised obedience, and faithfulness, these are they are conceptually connected. The other thing is Paul does believe, I think, that Christ's own fidelity to his messianic vocation does express something of God's faithfulness. But more importantly, when Paul talks about this passage, he's connecting it to a whole bunch of themes related to union with Christ, about being participation is really big, about attaining Christ's resurrection, fellowship in Christ's sufferings, being conformed to the likeness of his death. So faith then here is not simply something has towards Christ. It's
Right.
something one experiences in him. It's a participation, you could say, in Christ's faithfulness, but that's also the source of our own faith in him, righteousness, hope, and life, and the like. And one German scholar, Wolfgang Schenk, has done a pretty good sort of, I think, breakdown of chapter 3, verses 7 to 9, where you do get this, pistis Christu, faith in of Christ, as a kind of climax. And I like his sort of way of structuring it. And that would make sense to view it as something important, as a parallel to chapter 2, verse 8 of Christ's own faithfulness. So this is probably the one place where I'm kind of, I'm willing to give the subjective genitive the benefit of the doubt. But what we have to remember is that the genitive itself is, I think, deliberately ambiguous. Because remember, when you've got like a genitive phrase, you have a head term, which the genitive then defines. So
Right.
if you've got a phrase like, righteousness of God, well, you've got righteousness, which is then delimited in relation to God. And it's the context that tells you, is this
Right.
God's own righteousness, or righteousness from God, avails before God, or that type of thing. So the genitive just delimits. So what we have in Philippians 3, we have faith as it pertains to Christ, or Christ faith, which could mean faith in, faith of, or it can simply mean everything about faith that pertains to Christ. And this is why the old King James simply calls it literally the faith of Christ.
Right.
They keep the ambiguity.
Right.
And in other places, both in Acts 3 and Ignatius, you get these really curious statements like the faith that is through Jesus. And I wonder if there is a deliberate ambiguity here, and we're meant to think of Christ's own faithfulness and our own faith in him, bound up with this participation theme. So normally I go for the objective genitive, but this is one passage where I think it certainly is capable of not suspending, but sustaining a subjective genitive, at least if not as what is being intended, certainly part of the corollaries that we can legitimately think about.
I think, I actually agree with a lot of that. I think this is, comes up in the work of Sam Williams, some of his articles, and Benjamin Schlieser kind of goes in the direction that you're talking about, even though he doesn't like the subjective view as a kind of very rigid view. But I think one of the linchpin elements of the Pistis Christu debate is you have to explain Galatians 3:23 and 25, when faith came.
Yeah.
And it can't be human faith. Obviously, that would be counter purpose to Paul's argument in Galatians and Philippians. So I do like some of the third view approaches, and some of those are in the book you edited. Press and Sprinkle offers a third view approach. I don't know if you know the scholar Shuji Ota, a Japanese scholar, but Shuji Ota argues for a subjective view, Pistis Christu, that actually goes in the direction of humans. It's not Christ's faithfulness to God, it's Christ's faithfulness to humans. And that's really interesting. He's written a couple of articles over the years on that. That's kind of piqued my interest. But I because of this ambiguity that you're talking about, I'm really open to third view approaches. Just like you're saying, we can't lock the genitive into just these categories we can easily name: subjective, objective. I think was it Hultgren who came up with Christic faith?
Yep.
As just kind of a description of a kind of faith rather than a direction of faith. In my book, Paul and Language of Faith, I talk about it more as the fact of the Christ relation, that now your identity is wrapped up in the Christ relation, which inherently is ambiguous. It's not one direction or the other, rather than in the law. And I think that's a better approach. But then the question is how you translate it. And would you say you would translate it faith of Jesus Christ?
Sooner when it comes to translation, you've got to kind of make a decision, and you have to clarify. I mean, unless you go for the old King James, the faith of Christ, I probably would translate it as the faithfulness of Christ. This would be probably the one place in the New Testament where I would go. Yeah, I think I'd be very comfortable going, because I just think it's filled with participation language. We're participating in Christ's faith the same way we participate in his righteousness, in his sufferings, in his resurrection. So I would lean towards this way. Just don't tell Francis Watson I said that.
Would you say, this is a question I've always wondered, because when you get like the Vulgate and you get some of the early translations, the Syriac and Coptic and other things, it's never explicated. It's just remains the same as, the faith of Christ. Do you think that the readers, the first Philippian readers or the first Roman readers or Galatian readers, did they immediately know what he was talking about, or was it ambiguous to them? What's your take on that? Would they have understood this phrase?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of phrases that they would not have understood, particularly when Paul is citing and alluding to Old Testament stuff.
Yeah.
Like if you're a former, if you're a convert from effectively pagan religion, you're not. I don't think you're going to pick up on all of these Old Testament resonances and
No.
subtleties of language. Yeah, so I think we've got to, I mean, and you have to almost imagine an ideal reader in
That's
order
right.
in order for people to pick up all these references. And
Yeah.
I think it would vary. And Paul's comments are, as we know, capable of sustaining more than one understanding based on what your context is. I mean, if you're coming, clean out of paganism, or if you were like a Gentile, a Roman, who was brought up, with some sort of adherence or association with local Jews and synagogues, and a little bit about the Torah and the prophets. I mean, that's different again. So it's really just relative to the individual.
Because he quotes from Job verbatim in chapter 1. And there was no way that, you're going to pick up on that if you have almost no access or background in Jewish scripture.
Right.
So I like to say he doesn't always write to the audience, to the readers he has. He writes to the readers he wants, which is, you said it a little bit differently as the ideal readers. I think that's probably true. And that says something too, maybe about preaching. I know we're pivoting here, but in our preaching, do we kind of water everything down, or do we make people work a little bit for the meaning? I've heard that as being a preaching strategy, and Paul seemed to have been good at that. Well, we're wrapping up here. Maybe some quicker questions here to finish up. What unique things do you think Philippians offers for Pauline theology? Galatians plays such a central role in Pauline theology today. You've written a commentary on Romans. What does Philippians offer that is a little bit outside of that, a little bit different?
I think Philippians offers joy in the Christian life. The Christian life also is the Christ-focused life. It's a life where things are a struggle. There is a conflict, and that's why you need to lean on the brothers and sisters who are around you and lift them up when you can. It's also about the story of trying to cultivate Christian virtues in yourself. It's also a big book about the gospel. I mean, the gospel is so prevalent. Paul says, I want to advance the gospel, live a life worthy of the gospel. I think it's the most evangelical book of that. And I think it's also the big book of fellowship. And fellowship is not what you just do with Christian friends after church, have some, Starbucks
donuts
or something.
Yeah.
Fellowship is your financial sacrifices for the sake of the Christian mission, and it's your partnership in those noble ends and vocations. That'd be my takeaway.
Yeah. No, that's good. I feel like it's one of those texts that we don't turn to first for Pauline theology, but I love to pose the question to my students. And if all you had was Philippians, I like doing this with James. If all you had was James, what would you know about Christianity? If all you had was Philippians, and I think you're right, you'd have a more emotional Paul, maybe even a more emotional Christianity. You'd have a more interdependent Christianity, relying on each other. Someone said once, if all you have is Philippians, you would think there were far more women in the church than men, because we know more about the women than the men. Euodia, Syntyche, Lydia, and so forth, if we learn some things from Acts. So it's interesting, some of that material, some of these traveling networks of Paul sending people back and forth, Epaphroditus and Timothy. So I think it gives you clear windows into the operations of early Christianity, right? At the end there, people saying hi and things like that, greetings back and forth. So I find that really valuable, and we shouldn't be so quick to jump to Romans, even though you wrote a great big book on Romans, but we shouldn't be so quick to jump to Romans for all the answers.
Yeah. Well, Nijay, this has been terrific. We'll have to do this again sometime.
Absolutely.
Chatting about Philippians. It's been a pleasure to work on the book with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who knows what we'll do together in the future. But mate, the Lord bless you and your new post at Northern Seminary.
Thank you.
Up in Chicago.
Mm.
So hopefully we can talk again sometime soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. Good talking to you.